I saw this strange animal back in June of 2012. Was helping my brother move out of his place just outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan. We were making several trips to and from his new place, dropping stuff off and going back for more loads, and we were on the final trip to his new place. We had been moving all day, and it was roughly 11 p.m. at night. And the moving truck with me was just me and my brother, who was next to me. Where he lived was a longer, desolate road, and as we're going down this road, this animal climbs out from the brush on the side of the road onto the road, looks over at us, and clears the whole road in just a single bound. This thing looked like a shaggy, huge German Shepherd with a wolf-like head. I don't remember the eyes at all, but it did bare its teeth at us. We pulled up on the road far enough that we had time to slow down to observe what it was. I just remember seeing so many sharp teeth in its mouth. It's like it had too many teeth. My brother and I were scared shitless, even long after it jumped off the road. Of course, he was only another 15 or so minutes down the road to where his new place was, so he was already second-guessing his decision on moving out here. He's still there to this day and hasn't mentioned seeing anything like what we saw that night again. We don't really talk about it though, to be honest. To this day, I don't have an explanation, but I'm glad I wasn't alone in the experience, or I'd think I was just totally insane. I was camping in northern Ontario along the banks of a beautiful lake. There was a dock that spanned about 20 feet over the water surface, and the perimeter was full of brush and forest. My best friend and I were the only two humans present, stargazing and talking about everything and nothing. What happened next is burned into my memory, but in the midst of our conversation, there was a deafening crack. We both turned our attention behind us and out stepped the most realistic-looking werewolf I've ever seen in my life. This thing had to have been easily 9 feet tall, hulking muscles, and a giant head. I immediately thought of the werewolf from the Van Helsing movie and damn near soiled my pants. This thing looked at me first, and I for a moment, and then stepped off into the woods as if nothing had happened. This animal had the most piercing yellow eyes I have ever seen out in nature. My friend and I were not only fear-stricken, but were stiffened by the shock of what we had just experienced. Slowly, I turned to my best friend as if to silently confirm that she had just seen the same thing that I did. The look on her face said it all. We both quietly retreated into our tent without speaking about what we saw until daylight the following day. I don't know if what we witnessed was some kind of animal or what, or if it was a different kind of otherworldly creature. Me and my cousin avoided a terrible accident 5 years ago when a large, unknown animal ran across the road and almost caused us to wipe out. I was riding on the back of my cousin's motorcycle with him down the highway. It was nighttime, and there wasn't much traffic out on the road. We came to a part of the highway where it goes up a hill and then starts to descend slowly. You can't see over this hill since it's quite long. Once we got to the top and started our descent, this huge gray animal bolts out of the woods to our right and sprints so fast across the road in just a few strides. My cousin started to turn the motorcycle, but this thing was already gone. Had this animal come out just a second later, we would have collided. It happened so very fast, but I caught a glimpse of it with the headlight hitting this thing. It looked like a giant gray wolf from what I saw, except its back was haunched all weird. I could only really make out the head somewhat because it just flew by us so fast. My cousin and I don't really talk about it because we kind of just brushed it off and continued on with our trip. I remember for the night though, my cousin was psyched about what we saw, telling me he didn't think dogs got that big out in the wild. This was almost 2 years ago, when I was 16 and didn't think much of it. But I was reminded of it today, and it gave me the chills. At the time, I lived with my dad 25 minutes out of town up on a higher mountain road, surrounded by lots and lots of woods, and a few neighbors scattered throughout. I went to sleep one night normally, only to wake up, but I woke up in a terrified state. My skin was covered in sweat and clammy, and I felt more on edge than I've ever felt before. I turned my head around to look out the window, since I do sleep next to a window, and see an all-black but very well-defined upright dog walking towards my front door, and I get this crushing feeling that it's going to attack me. This thing was pitch black and just a giant shape. I remember jumping out of my bed and running to my room door, which was open, and getting to the front door to make sure it was locked. I quickly scrambled to make sure all my curtains and windows were tightly locked. I waited quietly, but didn't hear anything. That was the first time that happened to me, and I had never experienced anything like that prior to this first event. Another experience I had is a two-parter somewhat. One night, I remember seeing red eyes staring back at me through my front window. These eyes were a good distance apart, high up in the air, heck, I'd even say 7 feet or more, and tucked away in the blackness beyond the light of my porch light. I screamed and ran to close my curtains and hide in my room for the rest of the night. Few nights later, I get another sensation again that wakes me up, like there's an evil presence outside my bedroom window. At this point, the curtains are closed entirely, and the window is for sure locked. I feel a paralyzing sense of dread and fear. After what felt like forever, I began to hear a scratching against the window. It sounded like a dog trying to claw on the glass. You know how when dogs paw on the glass repeatedly? It was like that. I honestly thought I was having vivid hallucinations until I realized what I was experiencing was real. At some point, I remember my room lighting up because something huge was standing in my window, blocking in all light from the moon. I didn't realize how dark my room had gotten, and once this figure moved from outside my window, the moonlight shone through better. These types of experiences has never happened to me again, and I'm really curious as to why I had them happen, around the same time, of course. I would say I had these in the span of maybe a month or two. I don't believe in monsters or anything like that, but whether it be a demon or something unexplained like an animal, I'll never be quite sure. My uncle had his encounter in the summer several years back. Only reason I believe him is because his whole life, he's always been a very super serious, no bullshit kind of guy. When he told the story, he sounded genuinely upset about it. He is a long-haul truck driver and was stopped on the side of a highway in a heavily wooded area. This was somewhere several miles in the middle of nowhere, but he said it was closest to Reed City. I can't recall what he said he was doing, but he had to fix something before he could just take off. Also, he didn't have a trailer on at the time. He had just gotten done fixing up his stuff and was about to climb into his truck when he saw a deer come towards him from the tree line. He said it looked like it might have been running from something. He assumed it might have been a bear. He was just getting ready to leave when he suddenly sees something looking at him through the passenger side window. He described it as having jet black fur and bright yellow eyes, as well as vicious looking, snarling teeth. It was so close to him that he could see its fur blowing with the slight breeze that was coming through. The window was open, but it didn't seem to notice, as was evident when the creature put its paw up to the window, as if to press it against the window, but pulled it back in shock when it realized its paw actually entered the vehicle. My uncle typically carries a gun on him, and at this time, he had a heavy revolver. The exact name and caliber is beyond my memory. He pointed it at the Dogman and pulled the trigger, effectively shooting it directly in the face. Finally, the truck started moving fast enough for him to be confident that the thing wasn't following him, should it have survived the shot. He didn't bother waiting around to find out. He said he still gets disturbed when he thinks back to that event. He described it as giving off this aura of pure evil and ill intent. in only the few seconds that he faced it. He has nightmares about this creature to this day, and he has refused to tell anyone about it until several years after it happened, for fear of people thinking he had lost his mind. Another reason I'm able to buy his story is because he has never been interested in the occult, supernatural, paranormal cryptids, etc. He had no idea what to make of this thing, but when he told me the story, I told him to look into the whole Dogman phenomenon. When he looked online, he said the artist's depictions of the Dogman perfectly for what he saw that day. My roommate, a guy we'll call Jim, spent his high school years in a little town in eastern Wyoming. I can't recall the name of the town, but it was the kind of place that most people had forgotten about, since the trains had stopped coming through. It was a very weird little town, and most of the people living there seemed to be very paranoid. A lot of parents would not let their children play outside after dark, and all unfamiliar faces were regarded with suspicion. Since the town was miles away from the nearest McDonald's or movie theater or shopping mall, there was nothing for young people to do but get shit-faced drunk. That's what Jim and his friends were planning to do on the night that this encounter takes place. A fellow classmate was having a kegger at his parents' house that night, which was 20 miles out of town on a dirt road somewhere. Jim had reservations about driving out there in the dark, because that general area was known to be sort of creepy at night. But his friends really wanted to go, and he was the only one with a car. So, after some coaxing, Jim and about 5 of his friends pile into his Buick and head out of town. About an hour and a half later, they realize that they are completely lost. They can't find the road that they are supposed to turn on, and it's too dark to read any of the signs. They haven't seen any houses or cars for a while, so they figure they must have taken a wrong turn somewhere and decide to head back to the main road. After turning the car around and driving in the opposite direction for a few miles, Jim spots something in the middle of the road up ahead. His friend in the passenger seat notices it at the same exact time he does and said, "What the hell is that, dude?" At first, they can't tell what they're looking at, but as the car draws near to the big black shape in the middle of the road, it starts to look like a mass of fur. Jim thinks it must be an animal, but it looks big enough to do damage to his car, so he slows down and stops the car about 20 feet away from the thing. At this point, it is completely illuminated by his headlights, but neither he nor his passengers can figure out what the hell kind of animal it might be. Since it hasn't moved, they assume it must be dead and start to argue over who will drag it over to the side of the road. That's when the thing starts to move. They all fall silent and watch as it stirs and then suddenly stands up. Jim would always preface the next part of the story with, "I know this sounds crazy, but..." He says he can't really describe what he saw because he had never seen anything like it before. The closest he can come is this. The thing, whatever it was about 7 feet tall when it rose to its full height. Its body was shaped like a human male, but it was covered with a thick, dark fur. The head, he said, and I watched the goosebumps break out on his arms as he said it was not human. It looked almost like a jackal or a German shepherd with a long snout and pointed ears, and its eyes were glowing in the headlights the way a cat's does sometimes. It was staring right at them. Jim doesn't know how long he stared back at the thing before he noticed that it was clutching a dead rabbit in one of its enormous hands. He had barely any time to register this bit of information when the creature suddenly flung the dead rabbit away and took a step towards the teenagers in the car. Everybody screamed and Jim slammed the car into reverse, made a U-turn, and got the hell out of there. Needless to say, they didn't make it to the party that night. This was right about a year ago. A few details out of the way first. I was living on 44 acres of mountain land. There are several buildings on the property, but the main 2 are currently my parents' house and their guest house. They are only 20 feet apart, or about the distance of a single-lane grave road. It was in my parents' house, cooking something. My house was the guest house since it doesn't have a kitchen or anything, so I used my parents' house for cooking and showering. No one but myself was living on the property at the time. Okay, to the story. I was cooking. I heard the house shake. I'm not sure how to otherwise explain it, but it sounded like the corner of the house shook, kind of like a dog had just shook it right after getting out of the water. Well, coincidentally, there is a creek right next to my house. So I walk into the living room from the kitchen on my way to the front door to check what's going on. I don't see anything. I looked outside and didn't hear anything moving. I was about to close the door and the cat comes in. Strange, I thought. But at the same time, it didn't faze me too much. It's a cat. They come in at all hours of the night. Well, sooner than later, my food was done, and I wanted to go back to my house so I could watch TV. As I was walking across the road, I noticed a figure off to my left. So I turned to look at it, and there stands this 5 foot tall. The ears on this thing stood straight up and were about shoulder height on me, and I'm 5'11". It was essentially a German Shepherd, from what I could tell, standing regular like a dog would, but its eyes glowed red. It was a complete silhouette of the animal, so I didn't see any features, but it definitely had the build of a German Shepherd. It didn't move. It just stared directly at me, 10 feet away. I darted into my house to grab my shotgun, and I came back outside to find it was gone. No sound, no signs of movement, just gone. I fired off a couple of rounds in case it was still around somewhere, but it was gone. My parents want me to believe it was just a coyote. Coyotes aren't built that beefy. This thing was huge and buff, like pit bull breed to kill buff, and Great Dane tall. Most accurate description of the animal I can give you. Glowing red eyes, vertical pointed ears, thick head, round like a pit bull, but German Shepherd shape, thick body. I couldn't see anything below the chest. I was just too focused on its eyes. But it did look like it had legs and was standing on the ground. It was also unnaturally still. Hello all. I had an experience to me when I was around 12-13 that I had forgotten about until it recently came up in conversation with family. It's about a creature I saw at my grandparents' property. To set the landscape, my grandparents live on an 8-acre plot of rectangular land that is gradually sloping upward the whole way. The top half is entirely woods, with the house sitting just below the tree line, giving a pretty good view to the rest of the property below. About 300 yards from the house is an old shed with a creek behind it. The shed sits near a fence/property line, and on the other side is a farm that used to be much bigger, but at the time only had 4 to 5 cows roaming around. So I was sitting on a swing on my grandparents' porch, alone, just relaxing and looking at the fields below. Off to my left, towards the shed, I noticed this gray-white animal with black spots here and there, walking on all 4 legs. Immediately, I thought it was one of the cows, as they were known to sometimes cross the fence into the yard. I got up to go tell my grandfather. When I looked back to watch where the cow was walking to, it then walked to the shed, raised itself off its front legs only onto its back legs, and just leaned on the shed. I thought it was odd until it turned its head in my direction. Even with the distance between us, I got immediate chills and this overpowering feeling that I just knew it somehow was staring right at me. I turned around and ran into the house, told my grandfather, and came back outside. It was no more than 1 minute from the time I left to was back outside, and it was gone. No trace of it, and no cows anywhere near the fence. I told my grandfather what I saw it do, and he chuckled, told me that's a nice imagination, and was the end of it. It terrified me so much of the time that I tried to put it out of my mind, but I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. Does this sound familiar to anyone? In March 2015, I woke up at around 3 in the morning. I have no idea why. Usually I wake up to drink water or use the bathroom, But I needed neither of those things. Anyway, I was living in Southern California at the time, near Camp Pendleton, and where I lived there was my neighborhood, then just wilderness. There was nothing beyond my neighborhood for miles, just land. Just an FYI, I have always been into the supernatural, but I don't think I really believed it until this experience. Before I went to sleep, I opened my window because it was hot, and I had my curtains open and my shades open, and I pulled them up to make sure air was able to get in. So at 3 a.m., I woke up and just looked out my window, which was next to my bed, and I thought I saw somebody standing at the crosswalk across the street. I was just thinking, that's so weird, because usually we didn't have runners or early morning wakers until about 5. So I got up and went to my window so I could get a closer look at what I saw. But I will never forget what I saw. This thing was standing, but its legs were bent, and it had some white fur covering the body. However, I could still see some skin. Its back was hunched over, and its face looked like some sort of dog's. If this creature was standing straight up, I'd say that it would be about 7 or 8 feet tall. Now, mind you, this was at 3 a.m., so I was just like, wow, okay, you're hallucinating. Go back to sleep. However, I was literally paralyzed and could not take my eyes off of this creature. Its nose and ears just looked so similar to a dog's or some sort of wolf or coyote. Where I lived, coyotes were very prevalent. However, they never ever really came into the neighborhood. And for anyone that says it could have been a bear, there are no bears in the area that I lived in because it was such a warm, desert-like climate. So as you can tell, I was just completely shocked and nervous, and I was able to shut my window. The thing turned its head and stared right at me. It was standing directly under a streetlight, so I could see its features pretty clearly, and its eyes were just so black. But somehow they were shining to where you could really see them staring right into your soul. That did it for me. I slammed my window shut, pulled down the blinds, closed the curtains, and jumped right into bed while pulling the covers over my face. I never went back to sleep that night. Flash forward 2 years later, in June of 2017, I again woke up, but this time I was just hungry. So I went downstairs to get some food and sat at my kitchen table. In the chair that I sat, my back was facing the window on the side of the house. This window was about a foot off the ground, and it was open about 10 inches because my mom forgot to shut it. Now, that window had no screen because it got torn somehow, and we just didn't get around to replacing it yet. Anyway, I had my earbuds in and was watching a movie or show. I can't exactly remember, but I heard a noise. I couldn't tell if it was from the movie or from outside, so I paused and listened. I then heard heavy breathing, but I have never heard this kind of breathing before, and it was coming directly behind me, right outside the window. The breathing was rough, rigid, and sounded anything other than a human. I was too scared to turn around and face it, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I had goosebumps everywhere. The breathing lasted for about 2 minutes. Then I heard heavy footsteps, as if this thing was walking away. After about 10 minutes had passed, I shut the window, locked it, closed the curtains, and ran up to my room. I told my parents about my first encounter the next day after it happened. I was 16 at the time and still living with mom and dad. They just kind of looked at me and laughed and said I was seeing things and that it was probably just a coyote. After my second encounter, I told them the next day, and that time they really thought I was just tired and was hearing things. My question to everybody out there is, have any of you experienced something similar to this? Was this just a coyote, or do you guys think I was hallucinating? It's been really bothering me for a while now, and I've been really wanting to get my story out there because I cannot deal with no answers.